Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. So in the last session, we ended up with having a functional definition of what ideological warfare means. Today, we're going to talk about the fields of ideological warfare. What are the venues in which we're supposed to fight this war that we have in our hands? So we can basically say that there are four fields that we can fight this ideological war. Number one, you have Orientalism. Then you have at second colonialism. Third is globalization, and fourth is the missionary movement. First, we'll start off with Orientalism, and we're going to first identify the challenge, understand what is Orientalism. Then we'll talk about a bit of its history, how it evolved and came to be, and what place it is right now. We're going to talk about the Orientalist approach, how they approach the East, how they approach the religion, the culture, the society, and what drives them to actually do what they do. And what are the resources that the Orientalists use when they're engaged with the other? So the first thing is identifying the challenge. What does it mean to be an Orientalist, and what is Orientalism? So Orientalism comes from the word Orient, which is basically from an Italian word Oriens, which means sunrise, right? And so one meaning of Orient is sunrise, and what it was mean that Europe, right? The place where sun rises in Europe, that would be considered the Orient, which is the East. This included the Middle East and Asia. Another meaning of Orient is that which lies beyond the Mediterranean Sea. And so in this case, the Orient refers to both Middle East and Asia, but it would also refer to Africa, which was on the west of Europe, right? And depending on what definition or what meaning you take, the circle of Orientalism would be different. If you take Orientalism from the sunrise, then it would include only Asia and the Middle East. But if you went with the second definition, that Orient refers to what lies beyond the Mediterranean Sea, then it would include both that which lies in the east of Europe and that which lies in the west of Europe. And this is usually the meaning that is taken into account when we talk about modern day Orientalism, because it studies not only Asia and the Middle East, but also studies Africa as well. And nowadays, Orientalism has a very bad rap, and so the universities have changed their departments. Now you call them Middle Eastern and Asian Studies, or the Department of African Studies. But essentially, it's the same thing. They do what they used to do when the whole thing was under one department called Orientalism, that is studying the people of these places. And so when the West studies the Orient, whether it's their culture, religion, customs, languages, history, civilization, that is what is known as Oriental studies or Orientalism. And the person who does that is an Orientalist. And remember, the keyword here is the West. So if someone like me sitting here in the East is studying the religion over here, studying the culture over here, this will not classify into Orientalism, right? It's only when someone sitting in Europe, being a Westerner, studies these areas is their work referred to as Orientalism. The Orientalism also has its opposite. It's when the East studies the West, and it's called Occidentalism. And I would then, in this case, be an Occident if I were to study the West, its culture, its religions, its social constructs, etc. But the challenge we face is from the Orientalists, it's from the West who study us. And so that's what we talk about today. Now let's talk about the timeline of Orientalism. And this is really important because this history actually tells us uh, what usually happened in these time periods. So the first time period, first phase, we'll place it between the first year after the hijrah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to Medina, up till to the end of the Crusade Wars in 700 uh, of the year hijrah. And this era is classified with the classical ways of speaking out against Islam, right? So, first of all, there was a barrage of questions and accusations against Islam, right? The second thing is a barrage of uh, there was a barrage of questions. The second thing that included was that basically, obviously, in this time, the Muslims, not only in the religious sense, were actually very advanced, but in other aspects also were very advanced in all fields of physics, chemistry, biology, astrology, you name it. They were champions in everything, right? And so their attempts included first undermining Islam, and the second is actually taking what Islam and scientists, the Muslim scientists and ulama have done, translate it into European languages, into Latin, and take that knowledge back to Europe, which was at this point in time going through what's called the Dark Ages, right? And the last part of this was basically the start of the Crusade Wars, which we talked about. And the second phase, we're going to place it between 1300 to 1800 Common Era. And this is the time when Louis the Ninth, the Crusade War has already ended. They know they can't defeat the Muslim armies head on. And so Louis IX, what he did was he collected all of the intellectual people of Europe, gathered together, and they sat and thought about what to do. How are we supposed to challenge this new problem that we have, this undefeatable enemy, right? And so this this happened around 1312. And so what was happened that there was a big conference, and the decision that they made was to include Eastern education into their educational institutes, because that at time was the prime scientific development of the era. And not only that, even the humanities as we know it were perfect, and Christianity had failed to actually uphold a society, and it was really breaking up fast, and so they had to get rid of that, but they didn't have anything to support it with. So what they did was borrow this ulum, build up your own philosophy to support, because obviously they still have that motivation of not accepting Islam because of the defeats they faced at the hands of the Crusade. So that is something that they had to address as well. So now what they've done is they've initiated in their own educational institutes, teaching Eastern knowledge, teaching the Arabic language, right? And about 16th century, the Christian Orientalists, they had the whole Europe uh, as a field in which they were working in now. And in the 17th century, the King of France, Louis the Fourth, he had books translated from Arabic, right? And he also had new books being written in the subject of history, in which what they did was they tried to promote Arabic Arab nationalism, right? Because at that time it was the Khilafah Uthmaniyya in Turkey, which was the main Khilafah, the main kingdom, you could say, or the government of the Muslims, right? And so they wanted to create a schism between the Arabs and the Turks. And so now this King of France had new history books written in Arabic, in which he's now promoting Arab nationalism in order to create that divide between the Muslims and divide them along those racial and national borders. And at the first stage of the Mustashriqeen, what they used to do was basically attack Islam all the time, but that was never holding up against the religion's greatness. So now, in the second phase, the new Mustashriqeen, or the Orientalists, what they were doing was basically taking those really weak accusations against Islam, which their ancestors had made, and actually debunking them. So they were trying to create this trust between them and the Muslims that we're not against you, and that we're just doing this objectively as a fair third person party. And so now they're also rejecting some of those myths and trying to create a trust so that their literature can easily enter into the Muslim markets, into the Muslim mindset, right? And so there's happening two, they're battling two fronts. First, they're trying to create trust, and then they're pushing the nationalist agenda in order to create a divide between the Muslims. The third stage or phase is between 1801 and 1924, right? And this third stage, what happened is that the European armies now try to subjugate the Islamic countries all over the world. Because at this point in time, the Orientalists have been working academically for the past few centuries, and now they had they knew the history of the areas that they wanted to conquer, the geography, the sociology, the culture, and everything. They were completely aware. And now when you have the knowledge of how something works, you are then able to tamper with it. You are then able to actually use it how you would want it, right? And so this is what they do. They had now had that knowledge base. They've been building up for years and years and years. And now they're using that to infiltrate Muslim areas, to infiltrate their minds, their markets, their education systems, their houses, and trying to now convert them or actually try to get a hold over them, right? And the other thing that they're doing right now is obviously if you want your culture to dominate, you want to create some sort of confusion about the other's culture, the other's religion. And a new barrage of academic attacks were being made at this point in time. So what they would do is they would usually, first of all, what we mentioned in the previous era, they were starting to reintroduce history as not Islamic history, but as Arab history. And the other thing they would do was character assassination, especially non-Arab leaders. So the non-Arab Muslim leaders, especially the Turkish, what they would do is take that person and start annihilating their character by fabricating events and fabricating a lot of other things and associating with that person to show him off as being unjust to their Arabs, as being a violent criminal and whatnot. And so this was being used by them in order to, again, further the schism between the Arabs and the non-Arabs in this regard. Now, obviously, the trust component still has to be there. So it's not that everything that they do was a direct attack against Islam. Sometimes they did actually really good work, which even the ulama were forced to appreciate because it was something that no one ever thought of or even tried to do, right? So what they would do is collect the really rare manuscripts and then research on them and publish them in really good formats. So that's something that they did in order to garner more trust. Now we'll come to the fourth stage, and we'll place it between 1925 to 1972. So in this era, what happened was basically they again started. It's been going on. So they started their barrage of questions, confusions, uh, and fabrications against Islam in order to prove that it doesn't have any base to it, right? That was something that they used to do. Now they've realized you can actually disprove Islam. So, what is it something that we can do with it, which would actually help us get these people under our control? So, in the fourth era, in the fourth stage, they now reinterpret Islam. That's their new mission. That we're not going to reject Islam. We're going to let you keep Islam, but you're going to be given a new meaning to it, which adheres to what we're saying and it adheres to what we want and not what it exactly is. So this is their new favorite game that they're going to play in this fourth stage, right? And so what they're doing is they're trying to create harmony between Western culture and thought and between Islamic thought. And we're going to mash them together. Like we see a lot of people would say that, Islam promotes capitalism, for example, because just like capitalism allows for there to be private ownership, Islam also supports private ownership. And just like capitalism allows that whoever puts in the effort should get the reward, Islam also supports the same notion, right? And then what they do is they take a few similarities that both the systems would have and try to show it to the people that look, capitalism exactly what Islam is, or democracy is exactly what Islam is. And that's how they will promote a new meaning to Islam, right? In which they're basically taking Western ideas, painting them with some verses of the Quran or the Hadith, and presenting that as an interpretation of Islam, right? And also at this point in time, they wanted a new support because in Russia, in the USSR, communism was also on the rise. And so first it was a battle against like Christianity, capitalism, Islam, and now that there's this third opponent, which is also attacking capitalism with full force. Now they weren't strong enough to fight at both ends. So what they did was try to attract the Muslimin toward their side, increase their numbers, and fight communism. And that is why you'll see that in this fourth stage, the frequency of attacks on Islam really decrease. They're not completely finished, but they do decrease compared to the first three stages. And the fourth stage, we're going to place that between 1973 and 2000. And this is where the West now decides that we're going to change the meaning of Orientalism. And we know that today as globalization. And so what they decide is that we're not going to use Orientalism anymore. And we're going to use the term globalization. And in 1991, when USSR was defeated and the communist philosophy really took a hit and was no longer applicable anywhere in the world at that time, maybe in China, but not in like a superpower sense. And now what they wanted to do was, why go back to having another fight with Islam? And what we could do is basically put our ideology and plant it on the entire world in a fashion that everyone is willing to accept it. And those are the five stages of Orientalism. Nowadays, after September 11 of 2001, uh, what we now know as Orientalism is completely in the hands of the Americans. So America was the superpower then. Right now, it is changing. The geopolitics of the world is once again changing. But up till now, America has been considered the world's top superpower, and they would control all the narratives found everywhere in the world. They control the Iraq narrative, claiming weapons of mass destruction and invading it. Fighting terrorism, that was their slogan, in which they used that excuse to wage a war against Afghanistan. And now they're supporting the Israeli narrative in Palestine, for example. So it's the American media, it's the American government, which usually had and has had up till now uh, control of the narrative, the studying of these different regions, and then utilizing that knowledge in order to conquer them or invade them. Now, the Orientalists, they have three approaches on how they actually talk about Islam, for example. The first thing that they do is what's known as the research approach, in which they actually do genuine research on Islamic material. So they find different manuscripts, they research on them, publish them, and they build upon the previous knowledge what the Muslim people actually left there, right? The second is that they have this slow poison approach. And what that approach is basically in which they, in a very subtle way, try to discredit and create doubts about the Islamic sources, the Quran, the Hadith, right? And also they slowly and indiscreetly attack the people through which we get our knowledge. Because whether it's the Quran or the Hadith, it has always been passed on to us heart by heart, and writing came later on. So if you discredit the Muhaddithin and the Ruwat, for example, through whose chain we get the Hadith, you essentially create a doubt in the authenticity of the Hadith itself. Same goes for fiqh, for example, to create doubts that, for example, Imam Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala or Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala, uh, what they actually did was create the hadith in order to support their juristic views, right? And so you're actually making them seem as the villain and painting that they tampered with the resources, and you want to create distrust for the entire fiqh literature that we have, right? And so this was their second type of attack, slow poison, in which they take things, our literature, and add some sort of poison to it, i.e., some sort of doubt, some sort of fabrication. And the third is the open enmity, in which they explicitly write things against Islam, against the Prophet ﷺ, against Islamic aqaid, ahkam, and other things, right? And we have examples of that, like Charlie Hebdo and the picture making of the Prophet ﷺ, and things like these. So they're openly expressing their hate for Islam, right? And the burning of the Quran copies, which happens. So all of this is explicitly saying that we hate Islam, and then we're going to do everything to go against it. But what drives the Orientalist? Why is it that they do what they do? So there are actually five motivations behind the Orientalist. So they have this crusade drive, number one, then they have the colonial drive, and number three, they have the defense drive. They also have an economic drive, and lastly, they have this academic drive. So amongst the Orientalist motivation is the crusade drive, and in this was basically a product of the hate and the jealousy that they felt after being defeated in battle by the Muslims multiple times in the Crusade Wars, right? And so, what their goal was basically to get Christianity on top and to actually get Christianity to what in their language could be called to defeat and destroy Islam. And so, the first thing that they would do was to actually say that Islam is just a cut paste religion. It's there's nothing new in it. It's basically an adapted version of Christianity and Judaism, in which it takes something from here, something from there, adds it together, and presents it as something new. At that and that it's not anything new. It's not a new religion. It's being copied from somewhere else. Second thing they would do was try to create doubts in the prophethood, and so that's what the Mustashriqeen would used to do. So they'll paint him as everything, as a statesman, as a very intelligent politician, as a military leader, right? But they didn't try to use the word prophet for him, right? So, for example, you might find a lot of people saying that Michael Hart, in his book of 100 Most Influential People, mentioned Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam at the first, not as a prophet, but for all the other worldly things which he achieved, which, frankly speaking, from an Islamic perspective, is not that relevant to us. It is him being the prophet of Allah, the prophet of God, that which has meaning to it. But it would create shukuk, doubts about his prophethood, by painting him as everything other than a prophet, number one, or maybe trying to discredit his prophethood by saying that he learned it from other people. And this is something that's happened since day one. Even the Kuffar of Makkah used to make the same accusation against him, that there's some person in Yamama named Ar-Rahman from whom Muhammad, peace be upon him, actually learns these things. Third they do is to try to create doubts in the authenticity of the Quran, right? And they try to paint it as a book written by Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and not something revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they also try to create doubts in the authenticity of the hadith literature. We talked about how they used to do that by targeting the chain of narrators, for example, or by s- saying things like the hadiths weren't written in the time of the Prophet Islam. It only happened after 200 years, as if in someone had to construct them in order to justify something else, but they never existed. So they create doubts like that. Also, what they would do is spread weak and fabricated hadith, because if they're weak hadith, you can pretty or fabricate ones. You can add things to Islam which were never part of it, which could help move their cause, or introduce something weak and use that to challenge the Sahih hadith or even the Quran, or the fact that you point out the weak and fabricated hadith, mentioning that the hadith literature is unacceptable. So that's also something that they do. They spread weak and fabricated hadith. And they would also undermine Islamic fiqh by saying that it was taken from Roman and Greek law, and there's nothing new to it, or the fact that it's a product of the human brain and has nothing to do with Islam. So these were the things that the Crusade mm, drove the Orientalists to do. And it also had a colonialist drive. And what their main target in this case was, so first of all, study Islamic customs and society, learn all Islamic languages, right? Because this actually, learning about the society and customs, equips you with the knowledge of knowing what is happening on ground right now, which you can then use to influence those people. And language learning was also important because as humans, we are designed to be attracted to someone who we can relate to. So, for example, if a Chinese person comes up and talks to me, right, in Chinese, I won't be that comfortable with him than if a person comes and talks to me in either, let's say, English or Urdu, or even Arabic, because these are the languages that I know. So I'd be comfortable with them, but I wouldn't be comfortable with someone speaking Korean or Chinese, right? Similarly, if there are a lot of people speaking English, you too do, but someone comes from your own country, like if you migrated to, let's say, Australia or Canada, for example, and a brown person comes to you, if you're brown, you'd feel more comfortable than if a white person came and talked to you, right? So we're designed in this fashion in order to come, this familiarity builds trust, right? And so what they did was to learn the different Islamic languages. So if they're going to Turkey, they would learn Turkish. If they're going to the subcontinent, they would learn Urdu or Persian, for example. Why? So they can talk to the locals in their own language and thus create trust between them. They would also undermine the Arabic language because the Arabic language is basically, if there were to be one single Islamic language, Arabic would be it. There's no other possible option. And now what they're doing is they're undermining Arabic and trying to promote a culture of local languages in which people leave the Arabic language behind, considering it as either completely useless or not worth their time, right? And it would also challenge the beauty of the language by, again, creating more doubts and claiming things against it which hold nothing. They will also start promoting reviving dead languages, right? And this was in order to combat Arabic language. So Arabic spread across multiple nations, even in North Africa. You'll see a lot of countries which are Arabic, right? Libya, Egypt, for example. So the one thing that they do was to go in those lands and try to revive their dead languages. So, in order to create a divide between the local people and try to prove them that, you're not Arabic, you're not Arab, so you shouldn't speak Arabic, you should speak another language. I remember when I was learning Japanese, I met with an Egyptian person, and he was very adamant on saying that I'm not Arabic, I'm Egyptian, right? And so this is how this divide actually is being created. You undermine the language, you undermine the entire culture that comes with that language. And I would encourage European languages because, again, language is closely associated with a culture. If you are undermining the language of a specific religion and you're promoting an entirely different language, what's going to happen is the person, the target, is going to become in a state of confusion. So there are a lot of concepts in Islam, for example, which the English language or any other European language do not have. For example, the word barakah, right? Someone immersed in Islamic culture understands the meaning of that word, but it is almost impossible to translate it into English. The best people come up with is blessings, but blessing doesn't capture the entire picture of the word barakah itself. So the language has concepts embedded in it, which is part of a culture, part of a religion. But when you change that language and get people to use an entirely different one, a lot of concepts become unfamiliar. A lot of concepts become more difficult to understand or grasp. And that's where the confusion comes in. And that is something that they would want. Also, they would fan sectarianism and tribal feuds, again, dividing people along racial lines. And then also glorify the Western culture. Obviously, at this point in time, they had the upper hand, material-wise, in terms of industrial revolution and so forth and so on. And because they had already colonized most of the Islamic world, and it's a very known psychological phenomena that the mahkum or the conquered is subjugated or easily accepts the ideas and the mindset of the conqueror. And that is when it happened that most of the Islamic world was really in awe of the West. And the West was at the same time glorifying their culture. That success comes with following the West. And then also with psychological wars, they had a superiority complex, and they also try to instill an inferiority complex within the Muslimin, trying to undermine everything that they've known, their entire culture, their entire religion, and whatnot. The last thing that they did, and I would say the first thing that they did, and the most important thing in their cause that they did, was the reinterpretation of jihad. Because jihad is something that they're most afraid of because they know that these are people who know that death is not the end and that there's something much greater that comes after, right? And if the Muslim nations ever realize that the way out is jihad to put our lives on the line, they won't be afraid to do that. And so what they wanted was that people should stop thinking in such a manner. And for that, they introduced the concept of things like monetary jihad, trying to get rid of poverty, or, for example, inequality, or jihad bin nafs, trying to fight the ills, the spiritual ills of your own heart. And there's no doubt that these are struggles that we face, and these are struggles that we have to do. But completely changing the narrative of jihad to this, that is where the problem actually starts. And so this was something that they would do, change the meaning of jihad to make sure it doesn't mean that you take arms against the colonizers, against those oppressing you. Because once the meaning is changed, once it no longer means to strive physically, it will be much easier to subject a colony. They also had a defensive motivation, a drive, which was basically trying to protect their own from accepting Islam, because Islam being haqq, being the truth, has innate powers in it to attract. And what they would do was to actually try and protect their own people from studying the true Islam. So that's why new books are being written by the Orientalists all the time to introduce Islam to their own people, right? And obviously, then it would be coming from a subjective lens, from their own experiences about Islam and not what Islam might actually be. So they want to defend their own people against that, right? And this is something that the Kuffar used to do from the very beginning. Uh, the pagans of Makkah, for example, would stop their women and children from listening to the recitation of the Quran in fear that they might be affected and they might accept Islam. They also had an economic drive, right? So what they would want to do is like the publishing companies, they wanted that it would be their books all over the world. So the profit that's generated by selling these books comes back to them. Also, the economic drives linked with the colonial drive in the sense that it was the Islamic countries that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has really blessed with a lot of things. So they wanted to get their hands on those resources as well. Finally, you had the academic drive, which was basically their actual genuine interest and curiosity about what Islam is, which drove some of the mustashriqeen to actually spend their entire lives studying Islam, just to know what exactly Islam is. Now, the Mustashriqeen, the Orientalists, talked about a wide range of topics, right? They would talk about the Quran, the Hadith, the Seerah, fiqh, Arabic, Islamic history, you name it. They also introduced sciences which were not previously known. For example, Islamic architecture and fine arts. Although architecture and fine arts was practically happening in the Islamic world, but it was not introduced as a subject of study. This happened after the Orientalist. So, for example, when talking about the Quran, Ignai Goldziher, uh, a Hungarian Orientalist, he wrote the book of Schools of Quranic Commentators. In Hadith, for example, it's a very famous book, Al-Mu'jam al-Mufahras lil Hadith al-Nabawi by A.J. Wensink. And this was one of the books, a very detailed, a very complex indexation of the Hadith. And this is something that has been appreciated by the scholars of the Ummah as well. Then you had in Sirah, for example, the life of Muhammad from the earliest sources. William Moyer, for example, wrote this book. In fiqh, for example, Origins of Muhammadan Jurisprudence by Joseph Shah. And this was the person who I previously talked about, who claimed that Imam Shafi rahmatullah basically started the fabrication of a hadith in order to justify the juristic views that he had. They also have books in Arabic by Bragg Trasher, who wrote The Synthetic Development of the Arabic Language. And in Islamic history, you have The Venture of Islam, A Concise and History in a World Civilization by Marshall. And this book in itself there's nothing bad about it. It's a very, not a very, but it's a decent read. There's nothing intrinsically, I would say, evil about it. And you have Islamic says The Zahiris by Agat Golzar. So obviously, coming from a subjective point of view, at times their motivation was ill against Islam. A lot of times it wasn't ill either. But the point is that they would talk about everything about Islam. And we have to admire their dedication that being Jews or Christians, they spent entire lives studying Islam. Not many of us are willing to study Islam ourselves for our entire lives, let alone studying other religions. But they did, and they were able to produce work for our religion, for Islam. And so that's something that we should take into account. Now, what are the resources that the Orientalists would use in order to produce this literature? Well, they would use direct resources like books, biographies, newspaper, and magazines. They'd hold multiple conferences, conventions, and seminars, encyclopedia, and the electronic media, whether it be things like blog posts, newsletters, social media these days. That's also something that they use. The radio, TV, everything. And those also have indirect resources like Western universities, especially now that they have Islamic and Middle Eastern departments, in which again they're focusing the same thing. They study Islam or they study Middle Eastern countries or other Asian African countries from a very Western philosophical mindset or methodology. And also, you'd have students and mentees of Orientalists who would, in fact, be from those very countries which the Orientalists write about. And what they do is come to these universities, learn from there, go back and spread that same mentality, what they just learned from their Orientalist teachers. And for example, Macaulay in India, for example, when he introduced the British education system, uh, in his speech, the words are mentioned that he said that we want a people who are brown skinned, but think like the white man. So brown skinned people who think like the white man. That is what they want, and that is what the Orientalists prepare in their students. Because again, I would be more comfortable with a brown person speaking to me than I would be a white because I look like them, I talk like them, I'm closer to them. And so they use that as a connection in order to influence. So these are some of the resources that the Orientalists have also always been using. Now we need to ask a very important question, and that is, why is it that the Orientalists were so successful? But why is it the case that we aren't that successful? Like, what made them so successful, and why is it that we are not at the same position? Well, one of the things is that they had all the resources available to them, provided by their government. They were actually supported by their own governments to do that. So they had all of the resources that were available, right? Their government took charge of these things. The other thing is ignorance from our side. So a lot of Muslim people are, well, either they're ignorant about their own religion, sad to say, but it's the truth, or they're ignorant about the fact that there's an ideological war that's being waged on them. And the other time is that a lot of Muslims, especially the elite class, they're very much impressed and inspired by European and American culture and language. Even the masses, I would say. I mean, for example, if someone in the subcontinent starts speaking fluent English, people are genuinely so impressed, like you've achieved an amazing feat in life, right? You don't need to know anything. You don't have to be special. If you just know the language, people are always in awe about you, right? And so there's this deep-rooted sense of insecurity about our own language and culture that the second we see someone in European or American culture or speaking their language, we get easily impressed. Also, the academic circles of the Muslims, the Muslim scholars, are either unaware of the Orientalists and what the works they're doing, or maybe there is some sort of gap between them, which is unfulfilled. For example, if we talk about the seminaries, Islamic Madaris, for example, it's not that they don't have a strong academic background to actually defend the Quran, Hadith, and our Islam, but there's a language barrier which prevents them from actually being able to access Orientalist literature in order to reply to it head on. If someone translates that book into their native language, maybe then they give an answer to it, but they don't have the language requirements needed to actually address it directly. So that's one of the reasons why we are ineffective in challenging them. The other reason why they're very successful and we can't seem to really fight them is there's a lack of incentive, right? People wanting to work in the Orientalist field in order to combat their narratives, they're not given enough incentives. Like, I have a family that I have to fend for, right? So I'm going to need a source of income. You can't expect me to spend my entire life not being able to fend for myself or fend for those tied to me, right? And like those governments supported those people, but our governments don't do that. And so that's why people really don't put in all their effort for these things, and they're going different places in order to meet their physical requirements. So we need to actually have to think about these things. One of the things that we could do is create more awqaf, a waqf endowments. So in the West, for example, universities are endowments, and those endowments have endowments to support them. Why is it that we don't have endowments for such institutions? Why is it that our masajid and our madaris always have to run on collecting funds? Why can't we have a business setup for it so that it can generate its own money, so that the people working there and our other institutions as well. Why don't we have that system? Why can't people be free of the thought of having to earn, right? And unless we actually address the situation, there's not a lot of things we can do on the academic front about this. So this is something that we really need to think of. And so with this, we come to the end of the Orientalist. And inshallah, next class, we'll talk about something that was a product of Orientalism itself, that is colonialism.